Hi, it's Amy. So I promised I would follow up with part two of W. Robertson Nichols, The Art of the Reviewer, where he talks about literary gossip and the eighth way of reviewing. In the previous essay I read, he talked about seven ways of reviewing, seven methods, the good and the bad. But he did mention there was an eighth, but that he would be setting it aside in that first essay, and here he is addressing it. Literary gossip is now fairly prominent in the newspapers, as well as in those organs that are more especially devoted to literature. It was perhaps still more prominent, say, 15 years ago. By literary gossip, I mean paragraphs about authors, about forthcoming books, about new books and new papers. So far as I know, this kind of journalism is comparatively recent. It is impossible to speak with any confidence, for we have no book which deserves to be called a history of English journalism, and the field is so wide and difficult that no one is likely to cultivate it. But I believe that the originator of literary gossip in this country was Mr. Francis Apanasi, who died recently at an advanced age, a brother of the Charterhouse. The Athenaeum had a hard struggle in its early days. It was started as an honest review, that is, a review independent of the publishers. John Sterling and F.D. Maurice were mainly responsible for its early numbers, and their high sense of honor is beyond dispute. The Literary Gazette had sunk very low and did not deserve to be looked upon as impartial or trustworthy. But the Athenaeum did not gain ground till it was taken in hand by Dilke, who established it on a firm foundation. Even then it had rivals. The Literary Gazette passed from one editor to another until it died at last in the 60s under the editorship of John Morley. A more formidable rival was the Critic, which was started by Mr. Sergeant Cox, the founder of The Queen in the Field. The Queen in the Field won a huge and speedy success, and it looked at one time as if the Critic were also to be a success. This favorable prospect was almost wholly due to Mr. Francis Apanasi. Mr. Apanasi was then a young journalist with a keen interest in books and authors, and a happy turn of telling what he knew. Mr. Apanasi, who was an intimate friend of the Carlyles and at home in many London literary circles of his time, contributed at least 2 articles a week to the Critic. One of them was on the sayings and doings of the literary world. The other was on a history of great publishers and great periodicals. One was signed Herodotus Smith, and the other Lucian Paul, but they both came from the same pen. They were extraordinarily good. I possess the old volumes which contain them, and I do not think there is anything in journalism now to be compared with them. They redeem the promise made by the Critic that its readers in the remotest part of the country should be as well aware of what was going on in London literary circles as the men who belonged to those circles. So long as Mr. Apanasi was working for the Critic, it flourished. But misunderstandings took place, and he went to Manchester. No one was found to supply his place, and after an interval of years, he was brought back. But it was too late. The circulation and advertisements of the Critic had diminished so greatly that its death was inevitable. The work of the literary gossiper is by no means easy. He must get his facts at first hand. Only from authors, from publishers, and from editors can paragraphs of value be derived. It is of no use to anyone, however benevolent he may be, and ask him for information. To go to anyone and ask him for information. You can only get the information indirectly in the course of friendly conversation. Even then you must be exceedingly careful. Much that is told to you is not meant for publication. Sometimes you are warned of this, but you need in addition to have a kind of instinct. Any breach of confidence or discretion will be punished by the withdrawal of further communications. To close up even one source of communication where there are so few is a serious matter. Sometimes the gossiper, who has turned out a poor set of paragraphs, bemoans himself because he cannot tell all he knows. If he could tell, he would be quoted in every newspaper, but he cannot, and so he must do the best he can. So great is the difficulty that some powerful journals are almost always blank in the matter of literary news, though they are quite willing to pay for it and occasionally take pains to secure it. No doubt the literary newsmonger is tempted to overestimate the interest of the public in books and in authors. He writes about obscure men in a friendly or in a satirical way, and the general reader is puzzled. He cannot understand those allusions to non-entities. Some editors feel this so strongly that they make little of literary news and are content to cut out from one paper or another. But when all is said and done, I believe there are a good many who are interested in the literary world and like to read about it. One meets very few people who buy books, and yet it is a fact beyond denial that books are bought. Any great bookbinder will tell you that more books are sold every year, and it follows that there are buyers. Those who buy books certainly like to read about them, and so the journalist who has the power to put together a really good literary column is always in request and likely to remain in request. So I came to the 8th way of reviewing, which bids fair to become the most popular of all. By this I mean the review that blends gossip with criticism, the personal review. Perhaps the most interesting form of the personal review is that of which the critic, from his own knowledge, can say something about the author. I take up this book with peculiar feelings. I sat on the same bench with the author at college. We knew him as Jimmy Thompson. He shone especially in the Greek class. His translations recalled for classical grace and beauty the famous verses of Professor Gilbert Murray. He was always ready, and yet he never seemed to work, and so on and so on. But this is not always possible, and then you must do the best you can. Here is a new book, let us say, by Mr. Charles Garvice. Begin. I shall never forget, while memory lasts, my first introduction to Mr. Garvice's work. I was starting for India one dark, wet autumn evening. My friend, the friend of my boyhood and my manhood, Harry Blythe, insisted on accompanying me to the gloomy station of Waterloo. I hope it is Waterloo. He went to the bookstall, and as the train was starting, he pressed a volume into my hand. There, he said, it is a book that will delight you. You will not know for a moment's weariness as long as you are reading it. That is by Charles Garvice. Poor Harry Blythe. We know not what is before us. I went to India and lived through torrid and adventurous years in a pestilential climate. He went back to his quiet but not unprofitable task. When I had overpassed my dangers and come back to London, I heard that my friend had been struck by apoplexy, and he was turning over the pages of his ledger. Such is life. This is a pretty good beginning, and then I may follow some account of the book in hand. There is a variety of the personal review which may be worth describing. In it, you begin with an incident and close with a continuation of the incident. Thus, you are reviewing a book, let us say, by Henry Seton Merriman. You start this. One winter, in the discharge of my duties as a special correspondent, I was compelled to spend some time in Odessa. Those who know that dreariest of towns hear a fair amount about Odessa, which can be got anywhere, may come in. I lodged with a singular couple. The husband was a gigantic Russian, the most reserved and reticent of men. His wife was a vivacious little Scotswoman. Among the only book in their little home was The Sowers by Henry Seton Merriman. My landlady was trying to teach her Russian husband English by means of this book. I had never heard of Merriman before, but to read The Sowers is to remember it forever. And now we have another book from the same magic pen. Then comes the review. Well then, I should finish up something like this. Does the reader wish to know the farther story of that strangely matched couple? The rest can be filled up by any reviewer according to his fancy. I do not mean to mock this kind of criticism, by no means. It is well done, it is more likely to be read and more likely to help a book than any other. And I should not be at all surprised if some popular newspapers that have not yet found the way of making their literary page interesting were to adopt it. Are reviews as good as they used to be? In other words, supposing an author puts toil and brains into his work, is he as sure of receiving fair, adequate, competent criticism as he would have been, say, 30 years ago? Many authors and many publishers will answer with an emphatic no, but I venture to differ with them. Some worthy critical tribunals have been scattered. Others have deteriorated, and in some cases most painfully. No one who knows anything about journalism will say that the sixpenny weekly reviews are as good today as they were in the 1860s or 70s. For that, there are many reasons, but in other places things are improving. There is now, I think, a greater desire than ever to recognize a new author, whether his claims be those of genius or those of scholarship. On the whole, I see no reason to be discouraged. Will there then be the journalism of the future? any place of importance for the competent reviewer? Certainly, there will always be a place, so long as books are bought and read, so long as the critic will have his chance. Criticism is not, never has been, and never will be a particularly remunerative occupation, but it has its compensations, real and great. If I might say one thing to the young reviewer, it would be this: leave the bitter word unspoken. As a great man said, it is so easy to be sarcastic. There are occasions which justify stern and severe criticism, but reviewers should stand up to men who can hit back. They should not strike the defenseless. One has to live a long time among authors and know their ways before he understands how much their books often mean to them. Here is a little book of minor poetry. The authoress has paid for its publication and is waiting with tense anxiety for the reviews. It is a poor little book, and there are 1 or 2 ridiculous lines in it which, if quoted, would raise a laugh. The true critic ought to be above that temptation. If he cannot possibly say anything good about the little book, let him leave it alone. When a novelist who, in honest ways, can attract no attention, takes a coarse or obscene subject, it is a sorry and pitiful business. But to attack these books is, generally speaking, to advertise them, so silence is best. In the case of a new writer, it is well to search for any signs of genuine promise and to dwell on these. The kind of review that I most detest is the attack on old writers who have done good work and are beginning to fail. There is a peculiar brutality in some of these. It is charitable to suppose that they are written in ignorance. One such review I especially remember. It was a clever and biting criticism of a book by an aged lady who had done great things in her time, and was then close upon the end. She was dying of cancer, but had time before she died to read that review. And that brings us to the end of that chapter on the art of the reviewer and gossip. So that is that.